Morning for me.
Also, good morning. Top of the morning to you. Yes, I hope the weather at the place you are is great, and I hope that the morning will set the mood for the rest of the day. I'm sure it will be great. We have an audience for you. People are very interested to hear about what you are going to share with us, your expertise in the field. Dear viewers, I just wanted to tell you and to remind you that if you have any questions for Marcus, you can always leave them in the chat right under the live stream. At the end of the session, there will be a Q&A session where the most interesting and relevant questions, I'm going to ask them, Marcus, on your behalf. Well, Marcus, the floor is yours. You can start. And yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I'll be sharing my screen, and you should all be seeing now the title page. I'm very excited to be here, and yeah, indeed, it's a wonderful morning. Weather is great. We have a fall foliage here right now, so a very beautiful day outside. The sun shining and the leaves turning colorful. So what I'll do today, I'm really excited to share some of the work we've done recently on sonifying proteins, including viruses, and I think it'll be a fun experience for all of you. So my work deals with various kind of ways of thinking about how to use new ways to make music and create sound. And as we all know, traditionally we make sound and music really from things like string instruments like harps, like shown here, or a piano, which is basically also a string instrument where a hammer hits the string and plays the sound, or drums, which are membranes. And these membranes vibrate and they create a sound. And the way this really sounds like is kind of like here. You can hear the beautiful strumming of a guitar, for instance. Now, all of these traditional ways of generating music usually involve strings, vibrating strings, membranes, and they generate sound waves. And actually, these sound waves kind of come to our ears, into our brain through the acoustic waves, pressure waves going into our ear, then exciting the nerves in our ear, and then directly being connected actually to the brain, and then creating an emotional or other kind of responses that music has on humans. So we have been thinking, what are sort of other ways of thinking about music and sound generation, and maybe there are analogies with matter, materials you can see, and exploring how they might sound like. So what you see here is a spider web, pretty obvious. And if you think about a spider web, it's made from DNA. Spiders make it really by playing with the DNA letters, assembling it into protein structures, forming nanocomposites, forming fibers. And what you see with your eyes actually is ultimately a collection of these fibers. Now, the message here is these fibers actually are made from hierarchies of structure. And that's very similar to the way music is generated. So what you hear in the background is classical style music. And the way we can imagine creating it is by thinking about basic vibrations, a sine wave, harmonic waves. The different sounds of instruments are created by overlaying multiple sine waves. By playing these sine wave collections at different frequencies, creating tones, melodies, harmonies, and ultimately overlaying multiple instruments, creating a sound of a symphony, for instance. And so this build-up of hierarchy is very similar between the spider web and what we see in music usually. And so we've been thinking about the significance of that, actually, and not only for creating sound, but also for understanding nature, understanding life, understanding materials. And if we think about music as an emotional expression of humans, can we also use music as a way of expressing living systems, like the inner structures of life, or DNA, or proteins, or spider webs? And maybe there's more to that, actually. And in that, music is a sound is a universal language to understand nature. And you think about insects, like this is a picture of a wasp. And as some of you know, wasps, for instance, communicate with each other and with the environment through these antennas, which communicate vibrations. Spiders, of course, are also very famous for using vibrations. They build their web essentially by sensing vibrations. They're essentially blind, and they see the environment, if you wish, by looking at the vibrational spectrum they see. And so we have, in the insect world, vibrations is a very, very fundamental communication mechanism. We have, of course, on the other hand, we have molecules. We have, as we know from quantum mechanics, an analogy between waves and particles. So, particles can actually be described as overlaying sets of waves. And we have sound, of course, which is sort of the human expression, the human experience of vibrations. And all of these actually can be described by a collection of what we call harmonic waves or sine waves. I alluded to that already a few slides ago. So this is how we can understand the creation of music. Ultimately, we could break it down into very simple sine and cosine waves or things like that. And these kind of look like that, very simple. And these sine waves are actually going to be the description we'll be using in this talk today in understanding how we can translate proteins and viruses into sound. So, and the reason why we do this is we like to obviously understand nature. I'm a material scientist, and I'm trying to understand biological systems and how they work and how they build materials. But we also are engineers, and we're trying to make new materials. We're trying to create new materials. And the way we want to create materials is by using sound. And what we're going to talk about in the talk today is to take a material, transform it into sound, and then play with the sound to change the way the material looks like. So imagine taking a piece of rock or taking a spider web, translating into sound, and then manipulating the sound, creating new sounds, composing new melodies, and then seeing what that new sound actually would be like if it were to be translated back into a rock or a spider web or a virus. And this is, has a real physical foundation. If you think about the molecular structures, this is what you would find if you open a textbook, chemistry textbook. You're going to find pictures like this, molecules. And I want to say that these pictures are actually misleading or even wrong because real molecules are continuously moving. So molecules at the quantum level, and we've already talked about that a few slides ago, they aren't static. They're continuously moving. They actually are waves floating in space and time. And these waves are very similar, of course, to what we have in a string, right? So what you see here is a violin string vibrating in slow motion, and this is really what creates the sound of a string. So again, we can think about the sound of molecules in a very similar way. We can think about breaking down all the motions of these molecules into their fundamental harmonic waves, which is done using a mathematical method called Fourier analysis, or the other way around, we can do called synthesis. We can create the sound by computing these vibrations. And then we can actually generate any kind of sound, any complex sound from that, from these many, many hundreds or thousands of different individual waves. And that's a method we use to think about how proteins and spiderwebs and viruses might sound like. So you think about a spiderweb and a cell, human cell, and a virus. This is actually a picture of the coronavirus pathogen. They're all made from what we call proteins. And proteins are really the elementary building blocks of life. They're encoded by DNA. And the DNA sort of tells the organism how to build life, and the way life is actually built in terms of real materials. That's what's called a protein. And we all know we need to eat proteins because our body needs the protein building blocks to build itself and to grow and to be healthy. So what we've done is we've began to explore how all known proteins would sound like. And the way we did this is we used a data bank called the Protein Data Bank, which is a collection of all known protein structures known to date. And you can see there's an exponential growth of structures we know. So we have a lot of data there. What we've done is we've computed these molecular motions of these proteins using a method called molecular dynamics. And that's sort of the technical term for describing, we solve the equations, the physical equations, the chemical equations to predict how atoms move and how they vibrate. And we've done this for all known proteins with an algorithm, which then led us to have an opportunity to really observe all these individual modes or vibrational modes which make up the complex sound of each protein. And it turns out that each protein actually has a unique fingerprint of sound. So if you listen to a protein, is unique. So you can actually determine by listening to the sound that the protein makes what protein it was that generated the sound. So there's a very powerful way of actually going forth and back between sound in protein into sound and then sound into protein because it's reversible. It's like a fingerprint. We can go both ways. Now, the way we make these proteins audible is using a method called transpositional equivalence. And so I'm gonna have a little experiment. In the background, I'm playing a little melody, and I'm playing it very high pitch in the beginning. And you're not going to recognize probably what it is. And as time goes on, I'm going to shift the melody to lower and lower frequencies. So basically on a virtual keyboard, I'm playing on the very right in the beginning and then moving to the left as time goes on. And at some point, I think now probably you're going to recognize what I was playing, and I was playing For Elise by Beethoven. And the way this sort of looks like in the spectrum picture is that I'm taking the spectrum and I'm keeping the relationships between notes constant, but I'm shifting the absolute values of the frequencies to low and lower frequencies. So that's how I can actually retain the meaning of music. I can shift it to different ratios, shift it to different frequency values, but retaining the ratios so I can retain the meaning, the significance of these melodies played. And that's the same algorithm we use, essentially the same idea we use for proteins. And that's how we can make these very high frequency protein sounds, which the human ear cannot hear in nature. We can make them audible to the human ear. And we can then build music based on these complex hierarchical structures we see in proteins. So these proteins are quite amazing. They, as I mentioned, they build all life. They are 20 unique amino acid building blocks. So these are the 20 basically letters that are encoded by the DNA that make all protein materials. And again, they have these barcodes. So what you hear now in the background are these sounds that these proteins make. And these sounds can be accessed now in various tools. We've created a couple of different synthesis tools. We have a tool that's implemented in Max, which can be used in creation of composition of music. We have a tool that is an app. I'll show that in a moment. And what we can do with this is we can translate a protein now. On the left-hand side is a lysozyme protein. We can translate that into sound and then into an equivalent musical score, which you can see on the right-hand side. So what you hear are really the real vibrations of these protein molecules. And you can do this yourself, actually. If you want to download this, if you have Google Play, access to Google Play, you can download an app called Amino Acid Synthesizer. It's free. And you can play your own proteins and actually compose them through the melody and then actually make them and explore what kind of protein you've designed through music. So it's accessible to everyone right now. And that's the method we use to generate new proteins. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this means. So again, this is a slide that sort of gives the framework for this. So again, going from material into sound and then being able to create new sound, like you've seen on the app a few slides, last slide, and then making that back into a material. And so how does this look like? Well, we can do this manually by hand, but we can also use artificial intelligence. And so what we've done here is to essentially create thousands of songs of proteins that are a resemblance of existing real proteins that nature has made, and then training an artificial intelligence neural network that can then actually make its own proteins once it has learned the patterns that make these proteins. And so what this means is we can then use this AI algorithm actually to generate new proteins that nature has not yet invented. And this is the way it sounds like. So what you hear in the background is a song essentially created by a computer algorithm, the AI. So this is not a protein that exists. It's something that nature has not yet invented, but we can translate the song back into a musical score and then back into an amino acid sequence and DNA code, which we can then use to put into a cell and then let the cell actually make these kinds of proteins. And so this is very powerful. We've made that. We've created the proteins, and you can see how they look like. These proteins actually are new. I mean, in other words, they're proteins we've confirmed that nature has not yet invented through evolution. So there's really a new kind of design paradigm we can implement with this. The other proteins we've made a lot of different proteins with this method and made some in the lab as well. So this is sort of a test tube where you can see the protein inside, and we're currently analyzing how that protein behaves and what it actually does, because we don't know what function it has. So the same method of translating proteins and designing new proteins, we've also used this for the coronavirus protein. And so you've all seen pictures of the COVID pathogen, which is the one on the left-hand side here. And if you think about the COVID pathogen, it is a really complex structure. It has these little spikes coming out on the top, which gives the name to this virus. Actually, the crowns, the corona. These crowns are the ones, the actual structure that infect the human cell, and the human cell infection sort of happens on the top of this crown. And so we can think about sort of trying to understand how that process happens and maybe develop treatments by understanding how this key protein in this virus actually behaves. And so, well, you can do that in different ways. You can sort of begin by maybe looking at the DNA code, and that's the actual DNA code of the COVID-19 pathogen. And you're not going to be able to see much because there are about 30,000 letters of DNA, but we really don't understand this language. I mean, it's kind of a gibberish language. We don't really understand it. And you can look at other kind of data like this. Doesn't really make much sense. So we have used the musical translation as a way of actually using our brain. I remember in the beginning, I talked about how music is directly connected to our brain. So now we have a way of translating the virus into sound and then letting the sound interact directly with our brain to be able to understand the virus. And so this is how that sounds like. This is the COVID-19 pathogen translated to music. I want to just play about 30 seconds or so. So one thing you hear is that the sound actually sounds quite beautiful, and that's because the structure of this protein, which you can see on the slide here, is quite amazing. There's a lot of loops and organization. There's a lot of repeat and variation, and these are some of the concepts we commonly use in music as well. And so you can see that the beauty actually is not a reflection necessarily of the fact that the virus is very deadly, but it's a reflection of the really intricate design of this virus, which you can see on this picture here. We've done this for a couple other scenarios actually. One of them is now we've looked at the moment of the infection process. So this is a protein structure which you see on this slide. That is the moment when the virus actually interacts with the human cell, and that happens through the so-called ACE2 receptor. You might have heard about that in the news, and that receptor is in the human cell, and the virus attaches to that and then begins to infect the cell. And this piano composition really reflects that moment. So it's a reflection of the kind of vibrations and patterns that happen during the infection process. So the next step is, of course, now again using AI, and what you hear in the background is actually we've used many different species of coronavirus. There are many different kinds of coronaviruses, of course, in the world, and they're not just the COVID-19 pathogen. There are many others like SARS and MERS and others, and we let them jam together. And so this is sort of a virtual jam session now of many different viruses. And you can see musically and creatively we can create some really exciting things. And in addition to designing new proteins, we have a sort of new palette, new canvas for sound generation. So in general, the connection between sound and matter, of course, run very deep. We can have really striking similarities between matter and sound. We already talked about the hierarchies. You remember that picture. And these the way we think about music is really a collection of hierarchical structures, from the individual sine wave all the way to the multi-instrumentation of an orchestra or a band or whatever music you're interested in listening to. Very similar to the kinds of stuff we see in materials, where again in virus or in a spider web we have these hierarchies of structures. And so that you can think about now. We're going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of music and why actually the coronavirus maybe has sounded so nice. And what are the sort of deeper meanings, implications of that connection between music generated by humans, like the thing you hear in the background, and music generated by nature, which is the COVID-19 pathogen, for instance. So the mechanics of music, how we call it, really is very interesting in a sense, comparing it to the materials design paradigm or the DNA paradigm or protein paradigm, in that music is really a collection of building blocks. This is a score of Beethoven Emperor Concerto, and you can see that even if you can't read the notes, you can see that there are patterns there, right? And these patterns are repeated, right? For instance, you have this pattern, building block B, I call it here, which are very high succession notes going up and down. And then you have building block A, which is sort of a succession of notes that are going up and up and up and down and down and down. And so you can think about music as a song or classical music or whatever music you're thinking about, really as a collection of building blocks that have repetition and variation. And that's what makes music sound interesting or intricate and beautiful. That's how humans have generated music in the same paradigm. In fact, we can actually use mathematics. There's a great work by Romeyer and al., which we have built on to try to break down music not as a literal expression of notes, but actually as an expression of operations. And the same thing can be done for proteins. In other words, there's these hierarchies of building blocks, and we can reconstruct or recreate these expression of music by playing on operations, unit operations, mathematical operations that then ultimately recreate the score. So that's sort of what we want to know functionally from both materials and musical perspective. We can understand compositions of Bach more in a mechanistic perspective in that way. We can understand Goldberg variations, which you might know is really a very powerful example of musical compositions playing with this idea of variations and repetition and using a concept called counterpoint. And that's the idea of counterpoint is really by using not just a single melody, but actually using multiple melodies that play with each other and against each other. And these counterpoint techniques that Bach has used hundreds of years ago are actually found also in protein music. So once we analyze the COVID-19 pathogen in detail, and we look at the score, we can recognize that this score features a lot of the techniques and methods that classical composers have created and come up with hundreds of years ago already. And so there's some really interesting questions, whether, for instance, Bach, for instance, or Beethoven, Mozart, and other composers really around the world in other cultures have created music as a visual image, actually, of some of the inner structures in our body, the proteins or life, and maybe we can actually use music as a way of understanding life or biology better. So that is something we're exploring as an unconventional microscope. So this idea of engineering design at all scales is obviously really important, not only for being creative and writing new kinds of music. You've seen a couple of examples, but also as an engineering design paradigm. So I work extensively with designing better materials, more resilient materials, more environmentally friendly materials, more low carbon materials, and all of these really can find a lot of inspiration in nature. And especially spiderwebs are quite intriguing. Spiderwebs have the strength of steel, but they're made, of course, as you know, spiders everywhere, and I'm sure you have some spiders in your room, in your basement. They make each cable of the spider web actually has a strength of steel, but it's very thin. And it is made, of course, very differently from steel. So steel is made in a steel factory. You need a lot of energy, you need iron ore, you need a lot of stuff. Of course, spider webs are made really at room temperature by eating a fly. So the spider might eat a fly or the wasp you've seen a few slides ago, and that's it. And then they make a web, and these webs are amazing. You can see these really interesting structures here. And the proteins that make the spider web are also the same proteins that make other things like muscle adhesion systems, which are one of the best glues in the world, actually are made by nature. We have cells, for instance, some neuron cells or other kinds of mechanically important cells that create really complex networks of proteins that basically are the machinery of life. So we've talked already about that earlier, but I want to remind you that proteins are everywhere in nature and they have many different diverse functions. And the reason the mechanism by which they create these functions is, again, very similar to the way music is created or the way other hierarchical systems are created by using these multi-scale building blocks that are assembled. And with our fascination in spider webs and insects and sonification and vibrations, we have done a lot of work recently on also looking at how we can use spider webs as a way of making sound and how we can use spider webs as a way of learning from nature. So if you think about a construction site, this is a picture I took a few years ago at MIT. Construction usually works with a lot of cranes, very complicated, takes a long time. Of course, a spider builds webs like this, very, very efficiently, and there are no cranes. There's no scaffolding involved. Spiders are very good in building really complex 3D structures. And so we've really began to look into that very, very seriously and looking at the imaging of how these structures are created. And this is work done with a collaborator, Tomás Saraceno, who is an artist and architect in Berlin. And he has a lot of spiders in his studio. We have also spiders at MIT that we feed with flies. The flies are eaten by the spider. The spider then builds webs. And these are the beautiful pictures of the spiders, and they build these really complex three-dimensional webs. So most spiders actually don't just build orb webs, which is a typical web you've seen, the two-dimensional spiral web I've shown a few slides ago. Most spiders actually build these three-dimensional spider webs, which are shown on this slide. And we've developed a method with Tomás Saraceno in his lab to scan these spider webs. And so what we've done is we've basically used a sheet laser to light up sections of the web and then use a computational algorithm to stitch together a three-dimensional model of that. So what you see right now is we're kind of flying into the spider web using a laser. As you go in there, you can see some amazing structures, right? So this is the kind of stuff that spiders build without a scaffolding, but they build that really from scratch by just using vibrations as a way of sensing the environment. We've developed a computer model from this, and this computer model ultimately allows us to really analyze this web structure in a lot more detail. So right now you see the same web you've seen a slide ago that we've scanned. Now you see the computational model of that. And we can go fly inside the web. We have a virtual reality setup actually where I can put on goggles and I can go inside the web and explore that. And one thing we have done is we have used this web geometry now as a harp. And I've actually opened the lecture with a picture of a harp and actually a Chinese guzheng instrument. And this harp has maybe 10, 20, 30 strings, depending on how big the harp is. And they're tuned usually, right? They're tuned to have certain frequency ratios, which is what makes it pleasant, makes it sound pleasant. Now, if you imagine a spider web, want to explore how does that sound like? So what does the spider actually see or feel or sense? Because spiders, again, remind you, they use vibrations to explore their environment. They kind of send out signals, they measure what comes back to their ears or their sensors, and they also generate sounds by other spiders, and so they communicate with that in that way. So we've done this by creating a musical instrument actually out of that, and basically creating a model of the spider web that we can use on a stage. So this is my student, what you see in the picture here, Isabel Su, together with Ivan Sapurin, Christine Southworth, and Ian Hadwick, who are also playing this instrument in different ways. And we've had a couple of shows with this, and we can basically see here a macroscopic image of the spider web and the sound that these spiders make. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to actually have an example how that sounds like at the very end of the talk, so you can hear how that sounds like. But the spider web, one of the things that you'll hear in a moment is that the spider web doesn't sound like a beautiful harp, because the tuning is very different. So when you think about a harp, I mentioned they are tuned to sound nice. Well, this is achieved by what's called harmonic tuning. And essentially what we're doing is we divide all possible frequencies into a discrete set of frequencies, usually in 12 tones, which is a very good approximation for harmonic tuning. And that's how much of the music, at least Western classical music and related forms, are created. And they sound nice together. And the reason is there are only discrete frequencies allowed. Now, if you have a spider web, this doesn't hold, right? So you can imagine in a spider web, it's amorphous. There's no specific tuning. The spider doesn't tune according to the human ear or the human brain. It tunes it to the spider brain. And so by listening to the spider web and looking at the frequencies, you can kind of see this is a frequency analysis of the spider web structure as we play the instrument. It's completely disorganized, and it sort of follows its own rules. And that's the interesting thing, right? So we begin actually by being able to play the spider web instrument. We can actually enter the world of the spider and hear it and see it. We have that, again, that virtual reality setup. You can put it on your eyes. On stage in the instrument, we project the spider web on a big screen, or put it on a big cube. So you really, as an audience, when it's dark, you can feel like a spider basically, and you can hear the sounds of the spider. So so that sort of is the idea, that we can enter the world of the spider, communicate with different species, like a spider in this case. And previously, we've communicated, if you wish, with a virus, with the human cell receptor. We've communicated with the reception process. So we begin to really have an access of our brain directly to some of the really elementary mechanisms of life and death. And that allows us then to also communicate by us humans composing and creating new musical forms. So we can take the spider sound essentially and work with that. And actually what you hear now you hear the spider web playing in the beginning. That's the sound of the spider web. It sounds a little bit eerie. And again, this is sort of the weird sound of the spider web that doesn't resemble anything human, because it's not tuned according to our own ideas of tuning. We can then take those sound bits, and that's what we've developed in the instrument, as a way of creating new sounds. And basically, you can imagine taking bits and pieces of the spider web and putting them into new musical forms. And as the music goes on, in the background, you can actually hear more of the harmonic tuning. And that's because I'm shifting slowly into the more harmonic and accessible to the human brain kind of tuning. And that's a way for us to communicate with the spider, right? So we can go forth and back between these ideas. So you've seen that, there's a lot of different musical forms we've created based on proteins, on spider webs, and other things in nature, living organisms. Music is everywhere. That's something you hear a lot, and it is in fact everywhere. You can see that matter actually, when you look very closely, as I've shown in the talk, everything's moving and vibrating, and these sounds can be made audible through the algorithms we've developed. You can hear matter, and you can actually use the algorithms also, the methods also, to make sound or music back into matter. And that's very exciting, right? So now you have an opportunity to translate sound into matter and use the creative parts of our brains by basically painting a picture, a palette of sound, and then designing new materials from that. And that's what we do in our lab. There's a lot of examples if you want to listen to some of the pieces I've shown. So all the music I've played was music I've created, and there's a SoundCloud page where you can download or listen to these sounds for free. So check it out. Including the coronavirus, which is actually a composition that's about 1 hour and 50 minutes long, because this virus protein is very big. So you have a lot of information in there. With that, I want to thank you very much for the attention, and I do hope we have some questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such an interesting... Hello, Marcus?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. I honestly never thought about, sound and music in that way. That was extremely interesting. I have several questions from our viewers that they wanted to ask you. So the first question is, why, overall, do you need to translate the protein structures into music. Why was that? He's asking why was that the need? What was the need behind that?
Yeah, so I think one way is really to think about music or sound as a very efficient way of connecting information to our brain. So as a scientist, I'm interested in using microscopes, right? And so we use microscopes that visualize structures of different magnifications. And we're always looking for new kinds of microscopes. And a lot of the data that's in DNA on proteins is you can't use conventional microscopes, right? Because all you see is just some collection of atoms, and they don't really make any sense. And the reason they don't make any sense is because these proteins have their own language. DNA has its own language, and it's the language of life, basically. They have their own grammar and meaning and syntax and rules. And so by translating it into a way that human brains can actually process this language is what we needed to do. And music and sound is actually one of those things to do that, because it's the sort of most innate ways of how humans communicate. Sound is obviously, ultimately, speech is also a collection of sound and information. And music is sort of more abstract version of this, but it's the same idea. So that's the reason why we did that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for answering that question. So here's another question. What kind of new materials are you aiming to create, if you are, and what kind of music or sound, as a second part of the question, you want to create out of that? I know that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we in the COVID, the COVID work we're doing, we're very interested in understanding the infection process and the so the vibrational features that happen when the virus attaches to the human cell, right? And so that's a critical point of the virus infection sort of chain. And to break down this process, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is to use antibodies, and that's actually how the human body also rejects or deals with viruses. But so you can imagine by thinking about vibrations, you can kind of find a counter melody. That's a simple way of explaining it. It's not literally like this, but in a conceptual framework, you can see it like this. So finding a new protein material that actually binds very strongly to the virus, much stronger than the virus binds to the human cell. So that's the design task behind that. So that's one thing we're doing. We're also looking at using vibrations as a way of detecting viruses, because if you have a unique spectrum of anything, you can kind of listen to those vibrations and detect them. Then the new materials we've made, when we make a new material, this is work related to COVID, but there are other materials we're making new enzymes, new collagen materials, new biomaterials. From a creative point of view, from a musical point of view, it becomes really interesting, in fact, to use these newly generated proteins as a way of creating new music and compositions. And so some of the things I've played actually today, including the jamming of the coronavirus spike proteins from different species, that was something like that. We basically created that new material that nature hasn't invented, and we used that as a platform to compose. And so now you have sort of gone through multiple steps. You've used the original protein in the virus to generate sound, then used a lot of these different sounds to find out the rules by which these coronavirus is actually made, and then use what the resulting prediction is from the AI algorithm then as a source for musical inspiration. And that's when the human creativity again comes in, and you can then begin to compose based on fragments of these sounds that are material that does not even exist yet. And so then you can kind of go wild with that as a musician or composer in creating all sorts of interesting new sounds and ideas that sound very different than anything that maybe the human brain by itself has created, right? Because we're taking inspiration from the virus. So the virus speaks to us, and we are inspired by that, and we can create new things that are, very different than if you write a piece of music to just model human emotions. Here you're modeling the actual viral structures.
That was a very detailed question. I think you partially answered one of the questions that our viewers asked, is how this music can help in curing COVID-19. So I think you partially answered that. Another question sounds like this. So this app that can help you to create this protein music that you take an interest in, who is it interesting for at the moment besides scientists that look into that, and who is using this application? Is anyone outside of the science world using that?
Yeah, no, I've seen. There's a lot of people interested in the creative world. Composers, musicians, in using new ways of creating sound. If you you can imagine. some people that use
Mhm.
conventional instruments only, right? Piano and strings and orchestra, but there also is a big group of people that are very interested in sort of inventing new musical instruments, right? And so that, or using innovative ways of creating sound, and that's a community of people that I know are very interested in these acid synthesizers in various ways. We've done that. It creates like the spider web. I mean, it's really instead of playing the guitar or violin or piano, now you play the spider web, or you play a protein, and it's kind of you have to learn that instrument, obviously, but since nobody else has played it, or very few people have played it, you make the rules. I mean, you become the one of the first people who actually create music with that, and so there's a lot of freedom, I think, to be very creative without being biased against what others have created. I mean, that's, I think, very exciting. What I think is exciting about that, and also just puts a new canvas on there. I mean, we see that, of course, you can make music using synthesis methods very easily. I mean, you can use electronic synthesis methods to make any sound you want to make, right? But that's not really what we're doing here. I mean, what we're doing is we make sounds that nature is actually using. So it's a physical basis to those sounds are very different, and that is a constraint in art. And in the creation of art with constraints, that's what makes it interesting, right? So you can then begin to ask the question. You take a look at a protein, like a lysozyme protein or a virus protein, and you begin to see, what kind of sounds can I tease out of that? I mean, can I create harmonies from that? Is there anything that resembles harmonic tuning in there? Do I see, some sort of ratios of frequency that I might also find in classical music? How do I find them? And it's sort of thinking about, if you're a painter, right, you would have a new set of paint colors, and these paint colors aren't just arbitrary. They're actually the paint colors invented by nature, and you're going to draw with them or paint with them. And that's very interesting creatively. So there's a lot of people in the artistic world that are very intrigued by that, for the scientists as well. But it also provides a connection. I think I want to say that I'm very passionate about connecting science and art and making science accessible to everybody in the world. And by being able to play a melody, anyone can do that, and you can kind of decide on your own whether it sounds nice or not. You begin to design your own proteins, which is something that usually only biochemists can do or biologists can do. So you become a creator of new life forms, basically, by designing new proteins through music. So it's a very accessible way of learning about science. And, I've had a lot of people that become musicians that have become very interested in the proteins and learn about proteins. That's terrific. Now you have education and outreach of STEM science, technology, really to a community of people that would have never learned about science and proteins ever, or mathematics. And so it's a great way for us to teach. So I use it as an educational tool as well.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at that. It's an open window for someone who wants to, just take a look at this field without proper education about biomechanics. Here's another question. Can this idea, your idea, be the first step in some kind of a commercial idea? How can that be used if someone would want to use that in a business or in some kind of a business like that? Can it be used, in your opinion?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, there's different ways. I'm not going to go into details, but I think that anytime you have an opportunity to create, to use that window or this microscope into life, that's intriguing. I think it's intriguing for us as humans because we're really genuinely curious, right? That's how we are as humans. We always want to explore, and so I think knowing that we can explore kind of the inner workings of our bodies, our own brain, which we don't really see. Is quite intriguing, and so I think that's an opportunity for sure for various interests. Yeah.
Thank you very much for answering that question. Here's another question from one of our viewers. The quote I'm going to quote here: Marcus, thank you for your presentation. Do you think of your work as technology or art? Is there a difference between them at this moment?
Yes, well, they're both. I mean, I think I've shown both sides of this. Yeah. I think the science is. Really comes in when you think about the way the sounds are generated, right? And then the more of a purely scientific approach is using algorithms like AI to make new proteins. Right? That there's no human intervention at all. It's basically playing protein sounds to an AI and letting it design a new protein, and you can make something. Where the art comes in, the creative part comes in when I then take those building blocks or those sounds as a way of creating my own music and use my own brain essentially to make artistic choices. And there are, and so I didn't really, in the talk I covered both sides. I didn't always delineate exactly where one ends and one begins. I leave this up to the imagination of the listeners or people watching this. But yeah, there is definitely both sides of it. And I would say the distinction is actually, is there, but at the same time, I think that I believe that a lot of science needs creativity, right? And you can see this all over the place. Great scientific discoveries come from creative ideas that people have, crazy ideas that somebody has. I can make that material, or we just had Nobel Prizes announced, and you can see that people had this crazy idea of editing genomes, right? And from an idea came the technology, because they worked very hard then to figure it out, and actually ultimately did it. And so I believe that in proteins, for instance, when understanding life, you also want to be able to kind of push the envelope, and art allows you to do that, because you don't have the constraints of an equation, or you can work with different parts of your brain. You can imagine sounds, and maybe this leads into a direction of a new protein design that maybe then you can then make in the lab. And so exactly what we've done. We've done that in some of the work we have shown today, where you use the creative side of your brain in coming up with a new design suggestion, and then you bring it back to the scientific analysis, where you then make the protein in the lab, you analyze the protein, right? So those are all vigorous scientific methods, but the initial idea for that new protein might have come from an inspiration, a creative inspiration. So I think there are sort of multiple facets to this, in addition to the outreach and education that I talked about earlier. But I'm a great believer in creativity in science. And the challenge, of course, is we have to understand when one ends and one begins, but if we can teach that and understand that, I think that's a great way of bringing creativity to science, which we really need. We really need those out-of-the-box ideas. So I think it's elementary for that.
Well, I agree on that. Thank you very much for answering that question. Here's another question coming from Kazakhstan. How many years do you think we are from an offline concert based on protein systems? And do you think that that music will become popular at any moment? I think this question needs more of imagination, but yeah, that's how it sounds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can. So you're talking about live performance. I'm assuming of this. I mean, we can do that already. We've done it with the spider web a couple of times. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, we did a performance in Cambridge. And you can do the same with proteins. There's definitely ways to do that. Now, the question becomes popular. That's actually a question. One thing that you'll notice when you do study the music more in detail on SoundCloud, on my page, or in my papers, you'll notice that some of the music that nature is creating really doesn't sound very nice, and that's because nature doesn't make the music to make it pleasing for human ears. I mean, human ears are tuned to, especially pop music, that actually follows some very simple building blocks and patterns. Like a couple of chord progressions, certain rhythmic elements, and actually there's a lot of similarity between different kinds of songs, and that's what makes it attractive. So we don't have to go on that journey of experiencing very new. It's different with more esoteric music or classical music, which is much more difficult to appreciate and learn. But so I think it's not necessarily that we're going to see a pop song out of collagen or spider webs, but because these systems aren't really following the same rules. I think artistically you could do something like that if you were to kind of mold some of the musical ideas from those systems into more conventional, popular ways of making music, and that can be done. And then some music I've made is definitely more on the side of playing with the existing motifs of musical composition that you can very easily access that. I mean, you can listen to it, you'll get it right away. And whereas some more complex structures, like the COVID-19 piece in its entire length, is musically very complex, and it is pleasing to some level because there are some elements in there, but the whole structure is very complicated. So it's not going to be a pop song because pop songs aren't that long. They have much more repetition, but yeah, it could be imagined for sure. And I think that to me it's more of I think you're probably going to have to make if it's aesthetically pleasing to a large crowd, public. We'll have to put it in the mold that is accessible. It's all about accessibility.
Yeah. Well, one of the comments in chat was that this person thought that the COVID-19 is going to sound, scarier or not that pleasing, because it did actually sound, very pleasant to the ear. That's because you described it, because of the structure of the virus itself. Well, here's another question: do you think that our perception of sound and music is limited to the structure of our ears? And do you think that, in the future, if we will be able to enhance our ears or our hearing abilities, will that change, a lot of things, especially your research, on how we look at the proteins at the moment? Maybe that will change, and we'll look at it in another way.
Yeah, this is a brilliant question and brilliant comment. Yeah, absolutely. I think actually I showed the picture of the ear at the very beginning, and I showed that because I wanted to show that the ear is a physical structure as well, and it's connected. There's an actual membrane that vibrates based on the sound waves, and there's a little connector to cells, and the cells go to the brain. And then because of that, we can only hear so many frequency ranges, right? And so if you were to go and implant a device in your brain that would basically pick up, frequencies at a much bigger range. Let's say you quadruple or even more the ranges of frequencies. What kind of emotions or impressions this would lead to in our brain? I mean, that's an incredible experiment to try. And I'm sure that with some of those technologies coming online, actually, you could potentially do that, and it would be incredibly interesting. Also, probably maybe a little bit worrisome. I don't know if I would. How much I would push this, because of course now you're really messing with your brain. I mean, you're doing so. We have learned hearing. We're very familiar with the sounds, but now you're maybe exciting regions in our brain through the vibrations that we don't usually excite by sound. And what is that going to do to us? We don't know. So there's a lot of unknowns. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love this question, by the way. I never had that question, but this is a terrific one.
Well, there's always a field of what could be if certain aspects would come to life. Here's another question. We talked about COVID-19 and how you structured it and how you made a sound out of it. Did you try to create sounds out of structures of other viruses? Did they all sound pleasant to our ears because of the way they're structured, or is just this group of viruses?
Yeah, so actually we have, it's also a great question. I mean, we had, I actually worked on other viruses before, and that's actually what led me to when COVID happened, led me to sonify that or work on that, create music from that virus. So we've done this before. And actually one of the reasons why we picked viruses, why I was really intrigued by that, is because they have a very interesting structure. So if you take a look at pictures of a virus, they're small. I mean, smaller than cells, which is why they're so dangerous. But in terms of being put in the air and floating around, but they're bigger than a single protein, right? So they have a little more complexity, but they're very regular in structure. And that is something that musically, of course, is really interesting. And that's what makes music sound pleasant in some ways, where there's this regularity in structure. I mean, if you think about rhythm, right? Rhythm is basically a repeat of a pattern. And if you had think back at the spider web, you had a completely amorphous structure. That doesn't sound very pleasant. So there needs to be some regularity. And so, yeah, and the short answer is yes, we have done other viruses. They many of them also sound musically very interesting, which is actually why I think they're great canvas for composition, because they provide this really interesting balance between repeat and variation. But the COVID pathogen is, I think, particularly intriguing. And in a way, we look at the protein. I mean, there's some really, really interesting things happening on the crown of this virus, and then the interaction with the human cell that are just really fascinating. And these, if you understand how to tease out those vibrational spectra and patterns, we could create some really interesting musical ideas from that really you wouldn't otherwise come up with, because the human brain isn't really, I mean, we can only recreate what we know in some ways. We learn just like an AI, and then we create things that sort of simpler or variations or compositions of other things we've ever heard. And so, to me, as somebody who writes music, I've been writing music for many decades, this has really opened up a whole new world, because I am no longer limited by my own imagination. I can sort of take nature into that process.
Great, thank you for answering that. And here's the last question for today. if there's a possibility, you know, to use the system to create new materials, right? To create new proteins. Do you think that that process should be governed, that it should be looked upon, that someone should check what people are working on? Is there any ways that people can use that not in the proper way?
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is true for pretty much all of science. And actually, so in a way, you know, these, I mean, that's a great point as well. I think you have now we now have the opportunity to really change life at a very basic level. You know, editing the genes, which the CRISPR technology allows you to do. You can generate synthetic life forms in the lab. We can make the proteins for that, and you can do that using computers. And so what I've talked about today, AI methods in using them to design proteins through understanding that language of life is clearly something that, you know, allows us to really begin to interfere at a very basic level there. And you can do that for good reason, for, you know, creating vaccines or treatments or biomaterials or better cement or better steel, you know, really trying to improve humanity. But yeah, absolutely, you could also use this method in the other direction. Like with any scientific discovery, you know, I think we were going to have to be vigilant in how it's being used and make sure that, you know, there are the kinds of checks and balances in place, you know, for people who want to make these proteins or create new life forms. I mean, that's beyond what I do in my research, but I think that's an area I think where the, you know, science policy or you know, maybe looking at the ethics of what we can do is really, really critical. Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. But yeah, again, I mean, my personal view is you can't really, once these technologies are developed by science, scientists sort of explore, they create, and there are many examples from history where fantastic discoveries in science have led to weapons and you know, bioweapons and nuclear weapons and everything. And it can be a very a traumatizing experience, I think, for the scientists to really learn later on that their discoveries have been used for you know, a purpose that they would never agree with. And that's, so yeah, it's been with us, I think, since we ever had science, you know, including any technology, including agriculture, right? So I mean, that's something I would just say we have to pay close attention to. Absolutely, it's critically important. Yeah.
You just with your answer, you reminded me of Oppenheimer and his speech about, you know, afterwards. What did he say about that?
Exactly.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. Honestly, I personally never thought about spiders or, you know, viruses from that point of view, from the point of view of sound or music. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure all of our viewers are gonna agree with me on that. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and knowledge and for taking your time in your beautiful morning just to be with us and to talk and to just share whatever your studies are at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Ну что ж, дорогие друзья, это была презентация Маркуса Бюлера, очень интересная с моей точки зрения. Я никогда сам лично не думал о пауках, по крайней мере, или о вирусах, именно с точки зрения звуков и, естественно, о белках тоже. Ну что же, дорогие друзья, это была последняя презентация на сегодняшний день. Еще раз расскажу вам о том, что сегодня было. С утра мы поделились с вами ссылкой на документальный фильм Фрэнка Поппера «The Gentleman of Vision». Ссылка и фильм вы сможете посмотреть в течение 2 дней. У нас сегодня было 2 keynote-презентации. Первая была на тему о том, как создать идеальный клиентский опыт. Презентовал ее Владимир Вулич. И вот сейчас буквально закончилась презентация от Маркуса Бюлера. Он рассказывал о вирусах и о том, может ли вирус издавать звуки, может ли вирус петь. Это о том, что было сегодня. Давайте поделюсь с вами, что у нас будет завтра, на 3-й день нашего замечательного фестиваля. Завтра, с завтрашнего дня, по закрытой ссылке вы сможете посмотреть фильм Two Horizons Саудат Исмаиловой. Фильм будет доступен 2 дня. Ссылку, как всегда, вы получите в 9 утра к себе на почту. По графику завтрашнего дня давайте расскажу вам немного, чтобы вы знали, что будет происходить в течение дня. В 14:00 по времени Алматы будет воркшоп на платформе Zoom, который будет вести Сет Синклер на тему геймификация в дистанционном обучении. Далее в 4:30 по времени Алматы будет еще один воркшоп на платформе Zoom. Там будет Владимир Вулич, и он расскажет о том, как перезапустить компанию для эпохи цифровых технологий. Далее в 5 часов дня по времени Алматы у нас будет воркшоп Аяш Мырзабековой, который расскажет и поделится темой о том, как разработать свой собственный курс «История и план действия эдупренера», предпринимателя в сфере образования. В 7 вечера завтра у нас будет сессия с Фрэнком Поппером. Он расскажет о сюжете, в котором главным является персонаж, и как стать self-made кинорежиссером. Модератором этой сессии будет Мади Мамбетов. И в завершении завтрашнего дня в 8 вечера у нас будет концерт от замечательной исполнительницы Зире Асылбек. Дорогие друзья, хотел бы напомнить вам о том, что у нас в мессенджере Telegram есть 2 чата. Первый чат Go Viral KZ, где вы можете узнать всю актуальную информацию о нашем замечательном фестивале в режиме реального времени. И второй чат Go Viral чат, где вы можете задать вопросы нашим организаторам, также обо всем, что вас интересует касательно нашего фестиваля. Не забудьте, что завтра утром вам на почту придет письмо с ссылкой на трансляции завтрашнего дня. Все те, друзья, кто не успеет или не успел посмотреть наши трансляции в прямом эфире, вы всегда сможете это сделать в удобное для вас время, ведь записи всех трансляций будут у нас на YouTube-канале Go Viral. Ну что же, на этой замечательной, очень интересной ноте мы заканчиваем наш второй день фестиваля Go Viral, дорогие друзья. Оставайтесь с нами, впереди нас ждут еще несколько очень интересных и увлекательных дня. Всем отличного настроения и до следующей встречи.